The series starts with Detective Helen and her colleague chasing after a drug dealer down an alley. The drug dealer begs to be let go, but Helen responds with a lecture. Just as she's about to be arrested, the woman suddenly punches Helen in the stomach and runs away. The punch seems to hurt Helen more than expected, and she pleads with her colleague to stop chasing the suspect and help her instead. It turns out Helen is pregnant and has been hiding the news from both her family and her workplace. She rushes to the hospital, and thankfully, the baby is fine. That evening at home, Helen decides to reveal her pregnancy to her boyfriend and fellow detective, Paul. Paul is overjoyed, and they celebrate together. Later, Helen is drawn in by news of the abduction of 2 young girls in her hometown. She's deeply concerned about the kind of world her baby is about to be born into, and she's even more shocked to learn that the main suspect is the husband of her childhood best friend, Linda. The next day, Helen asks her boss for permission to return to her hometown and take charge of the case. However, due to her personal connection to the suspect's wife, her boss initially refuses. Helen then tries another approach. She reveals her pregnancy and asks to return home to share the news with her father. Her boss realizes what Helen is trying to do, smiles, and agrees to let her go back to observe the case, but without direct involvement. Paul also decides to come along to take care of Helen and the baby. When they arrive in town, their first stop is Linda's house, now surrounded by police and onlookers. There, they meet Detective Sophie. Only Helen is allowed inside. Helen greets Linda, and the reunion is clearly awkward under these circumstances. We learn that Linda married the suspect, Stephen, 5 years ago. She already has 2 children, Charlie and Danny, from a previous marriage, and according to her, Stephen has always been kind to them. Meanwhile, Paul finds out that the lead detective on the case is Tim, an old colleague of his, so he heads to the station to speak with him and gather some information. Stephen is a schoolteacher, and he was last seen picking up one of the missing girls, Poppy. Police now suspect he has already killed the girls and dumped their bodies in the river, but with the recent flooding, it's difficult to track any evidence. Later, the couple visits Helen's father, Robert, and his partner Sid. They have a brief conversation about the case, and Helen shares the good news about her pregnancy. The next day, Abigail's body is found in the woods, and Linda is taken in for questioning. She asks Helen to accompany her, and Helen agrees. At the station, Detective Tim reveals they found Stephen's favorite brand of cigarette near the body and are running tests. He's confident Stephen's DNA will be all over it. Plus, they checked Stephen's computer and found disturbing search history. Despite this, Linda continues to insist that her husband is innocent. Later, Helen goes to the local pub with Paul and meets her sister's old friend, Paula, and Paula's husband, Gavin. After having drinks together, Paula invites the couple over for brunch the next day. When Helen declines, Paula brings up how Helen and Linda used to bully her and Helen's sister, Jenny. Helen doesn't remember doing that, but she's still unsettled by Paula's comment. That night, Helen receives multiple calls from a man named Adam, but she chooses to delete them without answering. The next day, she visits the location in the woods where Abigail's body was found. The scene is brutal, so Helen only looks at the crime scene photos. The body had been burned and badly decomposed for over a week. Strangely, it was buried very shallowly near the surface, yet no one had discovered it the entire time. Meanwhile, Paul goes on a walk with Robert and his dog. He asks why Helen rarely returns to her hometown. Robert suggests it's probably because she had a difficult teenage life and has always been ambitious. While driving back to the city, Helen finds a car stopped in the middle of the road. She pulls over to check, and suddenly has a vision of her younger self with Linda. Just then, she spots Gavin, who turns out to be the car owner. He rushes back to his vehicle and drives off suspiciously. Meanwhile, Paul is at the pub and notices a man named Shelley, who works there. The young waitress seems to have something going on with him. Later, Helen joins Paul at the pub and they talk with Trevor, the pub owner and a former police officer. Trevor tells them that Stephen seemed like a normal, friendly guy and that people in town often offer each other lifts, so picking up Poppy might not have meant anything sinister. He also recalls that Abigail was a nice girl with a large rose tattoo on her arm. While they're talking, a local man walks in and complains about his piglets being stolen the night before. Helen begins to suspect that Stephen might not be the real culprit, but Paul still disagrees. The next day is the first court hearing. Tim remains convinced that Stephen is the killer, but Helen questions him. If the body was found in such a commonly visited place, why did it take so long to discover it? Tim dismisses all of Helen's points and accuses her of being emotionally compromised because she's Linda's friend and currently pregnant. Paul becomes angry and demands an apology, but Helen tells him it's fine. Later in the courtroom, Stephen continues to insist he's innocent, and the case is sent to the Crown Court for trial. Paul calls his friend Philip, a forensic scientist, to discuss the case. While on the phone, Phil happens to be standing in front of a tattoo parlor and sees Shelley kissing another young girl. Helen brings Linda home, where reporters surround the house. Helen's image appears in the news, and her boss calls to tell her to stop getting too involved with Linda, but there seems to be a deeper bond between Helen and Linda, rooted in something from their past. However, that's not the only secret Helen is keeping. Later, she meets with Adam, who asks if her baby is his, and meanwhile, Poppy is shown being held hostage in a filthy, hidden location. Helen drives to a remote spot to talk. Adam insists the baby is his and says he wants to tell Paul, but Helen refuses. He found out about the pregnancy from the colleague who drove her to the hospital. Their conversation is interrupted when Sophie calls Helen. Stephen has tried to kill himself. Helen kicks Adam out of the car in the middle of nowhere and rushes to the hospital. Adam is furious and again urges her to tell Paul the truth. At the hospital, Stephen now is stable. He stabbed himself with a ballpoint pen but got saved in time. After comforting Linda, Helen returns to town but is harassed and spat on by a group of teenagers for supporting Linda. Shocked, Helen is then surprised to see Philip arrive in town after Paul's request. The three meet at a pub to discuss the case. Philip has already examined Abigail's body. It's badly decomposed. He estimates she's been dead for 3 to 4 weeks and found 3 kinds of insects on her. Their conversation is interrupted when Philip notices a man giving him a suggesting look. He takes it as a sign and follows the man to the bathroom but ends up getting punched in the face. Later, Helen takes Philip to meet her father. That night, after dinner, Phil entertains everyone by talking about his work. Helen excuses herself and goes to bed early. She stays on bed but seems pretty depressing. A flashback shows young Helen upset in her room. Later that night, she sneaks out and sees 3 girls hanging around a tattoo shop. The next morning, Phil and Paul visit the site where Abigail's body was found. Phil believes the killer may have burned the body just enough to let bugs in, possibly to fake the time of death. They wonder where the killer got the bugs, whether he buys them or raises them himself. Later, Gavin spots Phil and Paul and complains about the police and media disrupting their peaceful town. Meanwhile, Linda sneaks out with Helen for a breather and goes to a restaurant. At the restaurant, a journalist approaches Linda and gives her a business card, offering to tell her side of the story. Helen grabs the woman's neck and forces her to leave. Later, Helen and Linda talk about a traumatic event from when they were 13. They were both abused. Helen blames herself for not protecting them. The next day, Helen gets a call from Jenny, who warns her not to tell Paul about the affair. Helen and Paul go to breakfast and discuss their plans and Phil's theory. Helen, who grew up on a farm, believes the killer might have raised the bugs using pigs. They visit pig farmer Bob Patterson to ask about his missing pig but find nothing useful. On the way back, they see Gavin drive by and decide to follow him. They trail him to a building. Inside, Phil tackles Gavin. He's been stealing. In the car to the station, Gavin mocks Helen for being a bully. She snaps and tells him to shut up. The next day, Paul says he has to return to Manchester, but Helen asks him to stay another night. Just as Helen tries to tell Paul the truth about the baby, a girl walks in. Helen excuses herself to the bathroom, and the girl Rory follows. Rory wants Helen's help to prove Stephen didn't kill Abigail. She says she was with Stephen when Abigail went missing. They only kissed, and would wait until her birthday to do anything more. Even if true, this means Stephen is still interested in an underage girl. Rory's story triggers dark memories for Helen. Outside, one of the rude teens passes by again. This time, Helen grabs him by the neck and squeezes his ball to teach him a lesson. Helen brings Rory to the station, but Tim still doesn't believe her alibi. Helen tells Linda, but Linda is in denial. Strangely, she seems more jealous of Rory than disgusted by Stephen's actions. Helen brings Rory home. Rory admits she knew Abigail. They had matching rose tattoos. After Rory leaves, Paul asks Helen what's bothering her. Helen pulls over and finally tells Paul the truth. She was raped as a child by Peter Harcross, Rory's grandfather. Her mom had died, and her dad struggled as a single parent. Peter pretended to help but instead used her father's sexuality to blackmail Helen into silence. She also explains that she acted cold toward Paula and Jenny to protect them from Peter. Paul comforts her. Helen, feeling guilty, confesses her fling with Adam and admits she doesn't know who the baby's father is. Paul upsets and leaves. Then Helen remembers Trevor, the bar owner, mentioning Abigail's tattoo. But Rory said the tattoo was under her breast. Trevor shouldn't have known about it. Helen realizes Trevor is the killer and calls Paul. They both rush to the pub. Paul arrives first, but Trevor has already fled. They track him to an house in the wood. Inside, they find Trevor holding Poppy hostage. He says he loves her and would kill for her. While Trevor is distracted, Paul attacks him and gives Helen time to free Poppy. Trevor knocks Paul out and tries to attack Helen, but she stabs and kills him. Trevor is dead, and Stephen's name is cleared. Helen finally tells her father about Peter. He is heartbroken and apologizes for not protecting her. 4 weeks later, Helen visits her boss in Manchester. She reports Peter Harcross for historical child abuse. He was a local counselor in her hometown and she wants the case to go public. As she leaves, she runs into Paul and begs him to return home and give their relationship another chance, but he refuses. Fast forward, Helen is now in the final stage of her pregnancy. Her co-workers throw her a baby shower at work. Adam is there, but Paul is not. Later, Paul watches from outside as Adam helps Helen into her car. Helen and Paul still live together, but Paul is emotionally distant and leaves all the housework to Helen. She wants to move to a bigger house for the baby, but Paul doesn't care, he's not even sure the baby is his. Helen complains to Jenny about her issues with Paul. Jenny suggests taking him out to reconnect. That night, Helen and Paul have dinner with Philip and other friends. During the evening, Paul starts to look at Helen with affection again. They return home, rekindle their relationship, and Helen apologizes to Paul. The next day, Helen goes to the doctor for a checkup. She also shops for baby clothes alone. That evening, she grows worried when Paul doesn't come home. She tries calling him, but there's no answer. That same night, a group of young men wait in a car for a woman to drive by. When she does, they follow her. The woman quickly realizes she's being followed and tries to speed up, but the gang catches up. One of them, Theo, shoots at her, causing her to crash into a bus stop, killing someone who was waiting there. Later that night, Helen is informed that the person who died was Paul. The next day, she is allowed to see his body. Helen begins asking Paul's friends where he had been that night. She thought he was working, but they tell her he had no assignments and had been acting strangely. Helen is offended by the implication that Paul may have been cheating on her. Theo returns home to his baby and tells the child he has a new job. Later, he sees the news about Paul's death and panics, fearing he may be in trouble for killing a cop. Meanwhile, Helen speaks to Paul's close partner, Gary. He doesn't say much but mentions that Paul had been distracted and stressed recently. Theo meets with another gang member named Easy, who tells him to forget about what happened. Easy says Theo passed the test to join the gang and then shows him where to drop off money from drug deals. Helen tries to get the address of the woman named Sarah who crashed into the bus stop from her boss. He refuses, but while he's distracted, she steals the information. Helen visits Sarah, who is seriously injured but alive. She admits she had been drinking before the crash. They agree that, in different ways, they are both victims. After leaving the house, Helen notices she is bleeding and is rushed to the hospital. The baby is fine, but she is told to stay off her feet for a while. Theo gets paid for the first time. A gang member named Snap mocks him, but Easy tells Snap to leave him alone. Theo uses the money to buy a stroller for his baby and heads home to surprise his girlfriend. Later, Theo visits Snap, but finds him shot dead in his home. Next to the body is a newspaper featuring the investigation about Paul's death. Paul's college returns Paul's belongings to Helen. She checks his phone and finds strange messages between him and someone named Frank. On Paul's iPad, she finds a video that is password protected but can't unlock it. Helen calls Frank and tells him about Paul's death. He says he'll be in touch regarding the funeral. Later, Helen asks Gary about Frank. He warns her that Frank is involved in criminal activity and advises her to stay away from him. Theo informs the gang about Snap's death. They dispose of the body in the river. Easy tells everyone to stay alert but to continue with their usual routines. Helen returns home and finds out that Adam came by. Jenny let him in. Adam still wants to know if the baby is his and promises to support her regardless. Later, Philip takes Helen to pick up Paul's car. She searches for clues and uses the GPS, which leads her to an old building. There, she finds Frank and one of his henchmen. Frank greets her and begins talking about the building, but Helen quickly shifts the conversation to Paul. Frank admits he has a bad reputation but insists Paul wasn't involved in anything shady. He says Paul once asked him to pass along some names, but he refused. Frank warns Helen that she's looking in the wrong place. Meanwhile, Theo starts to feel like he's being followed. He calls a gang member named Mikey, and they agree to meet. However, Mikey is shot and killed while on the phone with Theo. Shocked, Theo rushes home. That night, Helen can't sleep. She checks Paul's car again and finds some parking tickets. She goes to the parking lot and asks to see the security footage. She sees video of Paul getting into the same taxi twice after parking his car. Theo gets home and begs his girlfriend to pack up quickly so they can leave town. Helen visits the taxi company and talks to the driver, Ray. He says he drives for a lot of cops and sometimes for a businessman named Kevin Sherwood. However, he refuses to say where he took Paul. He warns Helen to drop the investigation or risk getting hurt. He also hints that she might not want to know the truth about Paul. As Helen leaves, Ray makes a mysterious phone call. Helen is followed by a black car. She notices it, and when she arrives home, a man confronts her. Helen quickly takes out her phone, snaps a photo of the man and his car's license plate, and immediately sends it to her boss in case he tries to hurt her. The man introduces himself as Kevin Sherwood. He explains that the taxi driver, Ray, informed him about her. Kevin warns Helen that if she's looking for the person responsible for Paul's death, she should focus on someone a bit younger and darker. He advises her to drop the investigation if she wants to stay safe and claims that Paul had been working with dangerous people to make some extra money. Helen drives off, but the black car follows her again. She manages to lose it and drops her car off at a repair garage. Later, she checks into a hotel and calls Adam, asking him to come over. She wants to feel safe, and they end up sleeping together. Meanwhile, Theo brings his girlfriend to stay at her mother's house and tells her he's found a place to hide for a while. He promises to visit her soon. Adam tries to talk to Helen about the baby, but she shuts him down and decides to stay with Jenny instead. Theo tries to leave his hideout to be with his girlfriend and their baby, but he's convinced that someone is always out there, waiting to kill him. When Helen wakes up, she finds her father, Robert, sitting beside her. They talk about Paul's upcoming funeral. Robert says he liked Paul, even though he could be arrogant at times. Theo gets a call from Easy, and they agree to meet up soon. Helen calls the police station and learns that investigators believe the shooter might be connected to a boy named Mikey. She visits the memorial site and tries to speak with locals, but no one provides any useful information. By chance, Helen runs into Theo on the street. They speak briefly before Theo is called away by a friend. As he walks off, Helen realizes she's being followed again. Moments later, she gets a call from the coroner's office. Paul's body is ready to be released. Theo meets with Easy and Wave. Easy admits he doesn't know who's after them but says it's now a matter of kill or be killed. He gives Theo a gun for protection. Helen meets with Adam and tells him about a strange file she found on Paul's laptop. Later, at home, she has a flashback to happier times with Paul. Easy and Wave return home and joke around briefly. But as they go inside, Wave is suddenly shot and killed. Easy is then confronted by two masked men who claim they're doing this for Paul. They force Easy to give up the names of others involved. That night, Helen hears someone enter her home. She gets out of the bathtub and looks around. Outside, she runs into Ian, who shows her his police badge. She tells him someone just entered her flat, and he offers to help her check. Later, Ian lists all the people she's recently interacted with, and Helen realizes the police have been secretly watching her. They also inform her that Paul was involved in an investigation into corrupt cops. The operations were codenamed after women, which reminds her of the Victoria folder on Paul's tablet. However, when she checks, the tablet is missing. Meanwhile, Theo is playing with his child when he gets a threatening call. News of the gang members' murders is soon announced on TV. At Paul's funeral, Frank tells Helen that the boys who died got what they deserved. Later, Helen speaks with her boss and learns that the shots fired at the female driver came from someone standing by the car, not from inside it. The next day, Helen uses one of her college's computer to find out that Sarah had drugs in her system. She goes to confront Sarah again and slaps her until Sarah admits she helped someone stage the accident because he threatened to hurt her family. However, she refuses to reveal his name. Sarah is then arrested. Helen visits Frank to ask about something he said at the funeral. She learns that Paul used to date Frank's daughter, who died tragically. Frank tells her to speak with Snooks, the pool hall owner, where the gang usually hang out. Helen visits Snooks, who agrees to show her the security footage. In the footage, Helen spots Adam. She rushes to the police station and punches Adam in the face. Then she talks to her boss. And they conclude that Adam tricked Paul into going to the bus stop under the pretense of discussing Helen and the baby. Then he set up Sarah and the gang to kill Paul and make it look like an accident. It turns out Adam was on Paul's list of corrupt cops, and he eliminated Paul before the truth could come out. Helen also learns that one of the boys involved in the crash is still alive. Remembering her earlier conversation with Theo, she returns to his neighborhood and finds him. She explains that the gun he was given was loaded with blanks and that Sarah deliberately crashed into the bus stop. She begs Theo to tell the police what really happened. Suddenly, Helen goes into labor. Theo rushes her to the hospital. Before going inside, she urges him to visit the station and talk to her boss, but Theo never makes it. On the way, he enters an elevator, where he is joined by Frank's henchman. While Helen gives birth to her baby, Theo is murdered.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe and like for more videos like this.